This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm your host, Andy Steele, and tonight my guest is Matt Campbell. Matt is a citizen of the United Kingdom, and he lost his brother Jeff in the North Tower on the day of September 11th. And Matt has made some news in the alternative media because he's refused to pay his BBC license fee, claiming that doing so would be in support of terrorism. So he's had to go to court over this. He'll be explaining what he means by that and what happened in court when he went. I'm going to play that interview for you in just a few minutes. But one of the things that you might find shocking, if you've heard about this for the first time, and I kind of found this shocking when I first interviewed Tony Rook, who did a similar thing a year and a half ago, is that the citizens of the United Kingdom are required to pay a license fee for the BBC. All right, they are required to pay a fee for television. They have to pay for their own propaganda. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine them doing this here in the United States? Having to pay for Bill O'Reilly, having to pay for Rachel Maddow, force-feeding you the 9/11 official story. Okay, this is what Dunkin' Donuts and reverse mortgage companies are for, paying for these propaganda machines, not the taxpayers. So I started Googling this. I found it sort of interesting that this exists and somewhat comical. And there's a blog called tvlicensegoons.blogspot.com. So I guess for the next 2 minutes here before I play the interview, sort of as a public service for the citizens of Great Britain, I'm just going to read some portions of this blog. It says, turning the tables on the TV license goons. There's absolutely nothing to fear from the goons who work for the BBC's protection racket, Capita/TVL. They have no power whatsoever, and they can't obtain a warrant to enter your home unless they have good evidence that you're breaking the law. And the only way that they can get that is if you give it to them on a plate by answering their questions and then by signing their 178 form. So don't give them the time today. We need to put these goons out of business permanently. And this has got tips for avoiding BBC harassment, and you can read those going to tvlicensegoons.blogspot.com. I just find this comical. I do. I can't imagine how I would react to someone saying I have to come pay a license fee for the television. I would tell them to keep the television. In fact, for a lot of the stuff that the BBC puts out news-wise, you would have to pay me to watch that. That's right. And it would have to be a pretty high price. All right. My time is valuable. And so if I'm going to sit down and watch propaganda, if I'm going to watch obfuscation and lies coming from the BBC, you're going to have to give me a lot of money. You're going to have to give me a lot of pounds, however that translates into dollars. And they better translate it into a lot of dollars for me because I don't want it. I don't want what they are selling, all right? So, yeah, Google this. Find out more about that. I hope they never even think about introducing something like that here. But in all seriousness, though, this is an important story Matt tells tonight. It tells the story of 9/11, the day of, how that affected his family, how their story of finding out that their loved one had died, and then, of course, like I said, his court case with the BBC. So I'm going to play that in just a moment. Before I do, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that beginning now. And that is 10 seconds. Matt Campbell is a citizen of the United Kingdom. His brother Jeff Campbell was killed while inside the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th. Matt is involved in a court case with the BBC regarding its support of terrorism. He'll be talking about that a little bit more today and explaining what that means. Matt, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Hi, Andy. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And so before we get into 9/11, please fill in the gaps I left in that short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
I've got three young children, and two of which were alive when Jeff was still alive. Sadly, he didn't get to meet my youngest. And I mean, I worked in the States in both California, and I'd spent some time in New York, and used to see Jeff fairly regularly. He'd only been working out in New York for a couple of years, but we still kept in regular contact by phone and email. And last time I saw him was 3 weeks before September the 11th.
What did Jeff do when he was working in New York?
Jeff was a risk management consultant for Reuters. He'd only been working with them since 1999. It wasn't his regular place of work. He was due to attend a conference on the 106th floor. It was run by Risk Waters, which I think was a British company. And I think a lot of the British victims, I think there were 67 British victims, 10 of which were either attendees or staff of the Risk Waters company conference.
So tell us about the day of 9/11 for you and for your family.
Well, we were on holiday, my wife and two children, in Lanzarote in the Canary Islands. And my mum had just flown out the day before to join us for a week. And I think it was sort of early afternoon. My wife had gone up off the beach to go and perhaps get some food for the children, and she came back down and said, I think something's happened in New York, something serious, and you need to go and have a look. So I left her on the beach with the children and my mum, and from what I could gather from a very hazy sort of TV screen, in a beach bar somewhere. I could see that obviously there'd been a big event in New York. I think at that point when I was at the beach, I think the North Tower had just collapsed. I don't recall seeing one of the towers still standing. And I mean, then it was just a frantic period of trying to contact my brother and my work colleague, who I had my own software company with two other chaps, and their mobile number was three different digits to mine. So I pretty much the only number I could remember off the top of my head. So I called into work. My brother Rob had spoken to Jeff's fiance and confirmed that he had actually gone down to the conference, and she hadn't been able to get hold of him. I mean, we weren't sure, at that point, whether he obviously had been killed or not, and we still had hope, even as late as the sort of 15th, when we flew out to New York. We still had a sort of very slim hope that there'd be a chance that perhaps he was in a hospital somewhere. And when it all happened, we were stuck in Lanzarote for a couple of days, and all we had access to was a very hazy sort of networked TV in the hotel, which had like one of the news channels from the UK, and couldn't really see what was going on. I mean, it wasn't really until we came back to the UK Thursday night did we get access to some proper coverage, I guess, of what was going on. And then the whole media circus started on the Friday. So they're my sort of recollections, I guess, of the first few days. And just, I said, we kept the hope that he would still be alive until that was crushed on the Sunday when we visited one of the hospitals in Manhattan and realised, he definitely died.
I've never been in a situation like that before. I can only try to imagine. And one of the things I remember after September 11th happened, I was just watching it on TV like most of the world, but I remember family members going down to the site like a day or two afterwards and wearing pictures of their loved ones on their chests, hoping that somebody might have seen this face and remember it and be able to tell them where this person was. And even though a lot of people didn't find their loved ones that day, I don't know. I mean, it seems like like doing something like that would at least provide you the feeling that you're doing something, that you can have a little bit of control over the situation, because you're down there actively trying to make something happen to benefit you, to figure out what went on. And I can't imagine what that was like for your family, being not just outside of New York City, but outside of the United States, being in England. I mean, that must have been very difficult. And then when you found out, now, just to clarify, did you go down to the hospital in the United States eventually to find that out? Or
yes.
Okay.
So we got on the I think it was the early Saturday morning on the 15th. We had a flight out which Reuters had arranged for us to get on. So, because it was frustrating, we obviously only knew what the newspapers were telling us, and we desperately obviously wanted to get over there. And it really wasn't until the Sunday when we did actually, go into a hospital and just realised that there weren't loads of injured people, or certainly not in a state where perhaps Jeff would be unconscious or whatever. We didn't know for sure until the Sunday that he was dead. And his fiancée Caroline had, done, which you were talking about, creating the posters, missing posters, and had been putting those all up around South Manhattan. And she's still got a few of those, and I've got one of the posters that she's distributed from those first few days. She hasn't actually found the strength to go down to World Trade. She only lives about 14, 15 blocks up from the World Trade Center. Still hasn't been able to go down there.
So the event happens. You lost your brother on that day. We were force-fed the official story pretty much as the event was going on. When did you start to question it? What made you start questioning it? Like, when did you start questioning it? How soon after the event?
We were probably saved like those first 2 days. We didn't see the endless, repeated loops of planes crashing into towns, just because the TV reception was so poor at the hotel. I don't know whether that made a huge difference with me starting to question the official story. I do recall an email which was from a British journalist called John Pilger, who sent something out at the end of October in 2001, basically saying, the war on terror, or this war is a farce, words to that effect. And I remember probably in December, I seriously started to read round, things like the build up for war before September the 11th. And oddly enough, I say oddly because I know he, I think as far as I know, he believes the official story. Some articles written by Noam Chomsky also just kind of started to wake me up. And I know by July 2002, I was convinced that the American authorities had allowed it to happen. And it was probably 2004 when I went much further than that in terms of them, to what level, I don't know, of them being involved, and potentially other states and intelligence agencies. But I've had this going around in my head for over a decade, and my wife always used to say to me, "What's the point of knowing all this stuff? What are you going to do about it?" And I suffered depression for the best part of a decade, and that I really only came out of that a couple of years ago, and I've now just to my chagrin, I wish I'd done this earlier, but I'm now speaking out and just trying to find out more myself about what went on. So I mean, I actually do things like my own freedom of information request to the FBI and stuff. I mean, as well as obviously reading all the research and stuff. But trying to get some sort of justice for my brother and everyone else who got murdered that day. And I know we're going to talk about the BBC court case, but there are other lines of legal action I'm looking to pursue to try and achieve some form of justice.
Yeah, and we will get to that. I'm just curious, what evidence convinced you the most about the buildings in New York?
I mean, oddly enough, well, I mean, you just look at them, you just look at the video, but I can't actually remember what was the strongest, not bit of evidence, but the counter narrative going on that was the strongest evidence. I mean, because I can only really remember probably most of the stuff over the last 4 or 5 years, in particular the last couple of years, just because I kind of went a lot deeper into, I think probably around 2006. I mean, just as an aside, in 2004 I moved out to Thailand with my family, and kind of just completely disconnected. Okay, you've got internet and stuff, but didn't really pay much attention to obviously the building 9/11 truth movement at the time, and I think it was peaking around sort of 2005, 2006. I was aware of it, but I was never one for sort of posting in forums and stuff. I'd always just be lurking, I guess, and watching developments unfold. I had a huge library. I mean, I got rid of a lot of those books in Thailand, of just different researchers' angles. But in terms of the more recent stuff, I think it was probably two things that I think make it easier talking with people about stuff, particularly people who aren't aware, or they're vaguely aware of these conspiracy theorists, but they don't really know much more than that, other than what how the mainstream media's tarnished people who question 9/11. It's probably Operation Northwoods, and learning more about Operation Gladio. And really the freefall collapse of Building 7, and that's obviously something that architects and engineers have been pushing a lot. More so, well, certainly the way I was looking at the work of architects and engineers, more on that than actually the collapse of the towers. But it is the easy way in. It's very simple, I think, for people to seriously start questioning the events as we've been told by the official narrative. They're the easiest, in my opinion, to start just helping people, prod them a bit and get them to think about stuff. I mean, Operation Northwoods is just, I know it was vetoed, but that gives you an idea, I think, or a glimpse of what the military apparatus is capable of thinking of and certainly carrying out. And I think you need that almost to shake people into, your government couldn't do that, or the military couldn't do that. It's to show them that at least it should start to break down some of the the natural barriers that people put up to never thinking that they could be capable of doing such things. But yeah, Building 7. I mean, my background is maths, physics, and computing, and for me, it's very simple that what we're being told about Building 7 is just, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, yourself, I'm sure the fact that NIST had to reverse their position. The BBC were talking about how it would be impossible or for a building to collapse at free fall. Is it the lead investigator said that essentially it'd be impossible because there'd be no structural support underneath it, and yet within 3 months of that draft meeting in 2008, they turned around and admitted that Building 7 did collapse for free fall acceleration for 2.25 seconds.
That's right. Now, regarding Operation Northwoods, what I always say to people, because people will say, well, they didn't do it. Well, what if the president hadn't put the kibosh on it? What if you had a different person? What if the president had come from the same stock that had drafted the plan? It would be in the history books, and people would be calling me a conspiracy theorist for talking about it. So we have problems here. And what about things that could have happened that we don't even know about? I mean, that's just something on the surface, and it should disturb anybody.
Which is why I think Gladio is important for people to read up about. Just purely because they did carry stuff out, and it has been openly admitted. I mean, the former Italian president has spoken about that, and I think he incidentally believes that 9/11 is an inside job and doesn't believe the official narrative. I mean, even the BBC, I think, did a documentary on Operation Gladio in the late 80s, exposing what was going on to create. It was the strategy of tension. I think it was called, but basically false flags and events were being engineered and carried out and being blamed on other parties. So this is not something new that we're suggesting that happened in 9/11.
Now let's talk about what's going on between you and the BBC. Lay it out. Tell our audience the background and why you're in court with them.
But I'm sure it might horrify some of your readers, the listeners rather, that we have to actually pay for a TV license just to have a TV set that receives any sort of live signal. You're supposed to have a TV license. It's about, I don't know, just under $300. I followed a similar action, which a chap had started 2 years ago called Tony Rook. I was motivated by what he did, but actually it's about not breaking the law. In the UK, we have something called the Terrorism Act, where, and quite rightly, it's an offence if you have reasonable cause to suspect that your actions through buying something, paying money for something, ends up funding the purposes of terrorism. And Tony and myself both have taken the view that the BBC, by not informing the public about the freefall collapse of Building 7, and doing some sly things in some of the documentaries that they put out, things like masking out the sounds of explosions of Building 7, when you compare it against the original footage, editing out a police officer asking the public to move it back, the building's about to blow up, and stuff like that. Now, you've got to ask yourself, why is the BBC doing that? Because clearly it's not telling the truth about what went on that day, and it's obviously to carry on the myth that it was the work of 19 hijackers and Osama bin Laden in a cave in Afghanistan that were behind 9/11. It complicates things in the official narrative if we're talking about explosives and controlled demolition. How would you get access to the buildings, etc. So, I mean, essentially, what the court case was about. So, first of all, it was I refused to pay my TV license. So when, because they have these sort of TV inspectors, they come round and they check properties to see if you've got a license, and they'll ask you, are you watching live TV? And we don't actually need to let them in the house, but I was more than happy to sign a statement to say that I was watching live TV. But I cited Section 15, Article 3 of the Terrorism Act, where it is an offence if I have reasonable cause to suspect that I would be furthering the purposes of terrorism by funding the BBC. Because it's a TV license you sort of pay to a government body, it does directly fund the BBC. And about sort of eight months later, I was summoned to Hastings Magistrates Court to try me because of the offence that the BBC were accusing me of, or technically breaking the law. But the crazy thing is, obviously, it was about a conflict of law, because I have more than reasonable cause to suspect I'll be funding terrorism if I paid for the TV license. And frankly, I'd much rather not pay the TV license than be guilty of funding terrorism. So after about 3 or 4 pre-trials, which was quite unusual for a TV license, they're normally sort of done in 5 minutes. I eventually got to court on the 23rd of March. And I had legal representation for a very small fee, I guess you could call it pro bono. And what we had to do, which would be different to what Tony Rook wasn't able to do, was get over this. There's a category they put the offence of not having a TV license in, which is called strict liability. And that essentially means there is no defence. You either have it or you don't. And if you're caught without it, then that's it, you're guilty. And in order for me to show any of the evidence of the BBC covering up the events of 9/11, we would have to get over this, rather ridiculous hurdle of demonstrating to the judges that it's not a strict liability offence, because it's not actually in the statute, it's not in the law. And we were arguing that certainly the way that the BBC interprets the law, they don't even themselves interpret it as a strict liability offence. But anyway, we weren't successful in getting the judges to rule that it wasn't a strict liability offence, and that was it. I wasn't even allowed to read out a statement. And they, found me. Well, I changed my plea to guilty because, basically, if I couldn't give a defence, I'd kind of be lying if I said I didn't have a TV license. But I wasn't able to present any evidence. And, I had a couple of witnesses, and, obviously, video footage showing the BBC covering up the sounds of explosions, editing out the police officer, and obviously the actual freefall collapse, and the NIST, the excerpt from the NIST report, and some other bits and pieces. Had something from Graham McQueen, the 118 eyewitness testimonies of the first responders. That was going to be some of the evidence I was going to present. But I said none of it. I wasn't even allowed to make a statement. I started to say a few words and they just shut me down, and that was it. And for the privilege of that, I got, between the fine, the court costs, and other charges, I think it cost me about sort of $600-700. That was my justice. That was my experience in court. I was gagged, basically. The ridiculous situation is, although they've found me guilty and they've instructed me to go and pay fines and stuff, I'm still breaking the law. So if I went out to go and buy a TV license, which I haven't done, I would still be guilty because I have more than reasonable cause to suspect that I would be funding terrorism if I actually paid for my TV license. And this is something I actually put to the magistrates court, and they basically just replied and said it's inappropriate for us to answer. And it's like, well, actually, no. Lawyers have their own angles and arguments from both sides. You've made a judgment, and by that judgment, they are actually effectively asking me or ordering me to go out and buy a TV license, even though the conflict of law issue still remains, that I believe that I would be breaking the law by paying the TV license.
Well, a lot of these people, in any country's legal system, don't really want to go into any of the more abstract areas of the law. They've essentially become glorified file clerks, this or that. It's you either pay it or you don't type of thing, not looking at the broader picture, which is the fact that BBC is not living up to its mission. I had Tony Rook on the show to talk about this when he was on. I was surprised when I heard about this TV license law in the UK. I had never heard of that before, and I think most Americans would be aghast if we had to pay something like that. I'm getting to the point where I don't even think I should have to pay any tax. I'm going to. I'm not gonna bring those troubles upon myself, but I kind of feel the same way about taxes at this point. I don't feel like I should have to support anything that the government's doing if they don't address this most important issue, which is the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence. What I find funny, too, is that, and I just confirmed this while you were talking on Google, but that BBC says they lost their footage from 9/11. In their response to the Jane Stanley reporting the World Trade Center 7 too early scandal, they say they're trying to assert that they're not part of a conspiracy, and they put out this statement. It's got 4 points on it, and it says, number 4, we no longer have the original tapes of our 9/11 coverage for reasons of cock-up, not conspiracy. So if someone has got a recording of our output, I'd love to get a hold of it. So you guys are paying for this service, and they've lost the tapes of one of the most important events in the 21st century. I mean, first of all, I don't know how TV stations log their footage, how they store it, but it just seems like a really wild explanation. It just seems really bizarre to think that they would have lost their footage. What do you think about that statement? What do you think about BBC essentially screwing up for the British people, the service that you guys pay for?
I'm familiar with the report. I think that's actually on the BBC website. You're probably reading that statement from. I mean, they have this thing called the Royal Charter, and they're supposed to do, unbiased reporting and such like. And there are some people who have tried that avenue against the BBC, but it's always put forward as just it's your subjective view. And I know that architects, engineers, and a lot of concerned citizens in the UK have complained to the BBC about their coverage. But on the matter of the Jane Stanley tape, I mean, whether they've found it or not, I don't know. I mean, it's a cock-up, and I guess mistakes can happen. But I think what's important about that tape is obviously the foreknowledge, which I did actually forget to mention. That the other reason why I refused to pay my TV license is the BBC has an obligation. Certainly, once it realised that the building hadn't come down. It had an obligation to Section 38B of the Terrorism Act to notify the authorities, and you would expect, being a news agency, they would actually do some investigation themselves. So I think in one of the conspiracy files documentaries they brought out, a chap called Richard Porter, is there saying that they have looked into it, but because Tony Rourke's actually a filmmaker as well. So he took the email that Richard Porter's reading from, sort of inverted it, flipped it round, and actually saw that they only started to investigate where the foreknowledge, the report came from in the first place as late as 2006 or 2007. So I mean that's not really the sort of urgency that you'd expect, or certainly how the law requires you to report it to the authorities. As soon as you become aware of foreknowledge of a terrorist attack. I mean, that was obviously scripted. I mean, I think CNN they also released it early that Building 7 had collapsed. But, it really is the BBC footage that most people are probably aware of her, reporting that it's collapsed, and yet it's in the background, and it wasn't going to collapse. I think they reported it 23 minutes early, but I think the bit where she's talking is probably about 15 minutes before it collapsed. Yeah, I mean, yes, cock up. I've got no idea. I am rather annoyed myself that between myself and my lawyer, we didn't, as part of the discovery process in the trial, actually request original copies of all the related BBC footage. Missed a trick there. But, someone else can take the same action. I mean, well, in actual fact, if someone does come along at some point to my house again and inquire as to whether I've got a TV license, in theory, I can start the whole stupid process off again, because I still refuse to pay the TV license. That issue hasn't gone away of me potentially committing a crime by funding the purposes of terrorism.
Well, and not to be rude, but I think that this law is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think it's possible for a government not to be biased in a certain way, and to force people to pay for propaganda is essentially what it is. I think is absolutely silly. And I mean, your case here highlights this. I mean, what I would request, I'm not a lawyer, but I would request all of the correspondence between reporters on the day of 9/11. If they had let you get past this initial hurdle, the next thing to do in a accusation like that would be to request, who said what to who on that day, all the correspondences. Now, I don't think Jane Stanley was participating in any conspiracy on 9/11. She's reading what she's being told to read. And so...
Sure. I don't, she's not part of it at all. She's just reading out as they do. They repeat stuff. But yeah, I mean, is it my job? Is it even through the legal action that the BBC were taking against me, it's actually the police that should be doing this. I mean, I have actually, because my brother used to work for Reuters, and I said they were obviously flew us over and kept in contact over the years. They got bought out by Thomson, now Thomson Reuters. But I wrote to the editor in chief of Thomson Reuters, and apparently the person who submitted the report and obviously kicked it out to all the various news agencies still works for Thomson Reuters. Now, the chap who wrote back, the editor in chief, just said, he doesn't recall where the story was phoned in from. I think something along those lines. But my point being is we shouldn't be doing that. It should be the police. So I know Tony Rook reported this foreknowledge to the police, and I don't think they've taken any action. It is something that I'm also considering doing, because clearly I can't get anywhere now through the TV license action, because I've been gagged and that's been ruled strict liability. So I'm guessing if anyone else tries to do the same action, they will refer, unfortunately, to my case to show that it's been already ruled a strict liability offence.
Well, I'd like to see many people do this, see them try to drag all of them into court over this. It would be, suddenly these people would have to start doing something. These people in the...
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Go ahead.
Sorry, Andy. No, I mean, it's more than dragging it through the courts. I mean, people are breaking the law in this country. It was my opinion that's what people are doing by paying the TV license. I mean, oddly enough, there was actually another piece of a ruling by the UK Supreme Court. I think it was in October, late 2013, where and the UK Supreme Court's the highest court in the UK. They ruled that the activities of the British government in certain countries and certain activities is that of terrorism. So, I mean, technically, anyone who pays any form of tax in this country is breaking the law, because that money is going to the government, and they have basically been accused of carrying out terrorist activities. And I know that there is a group of people who are trying to push that angle back onto the authorities because of the various illegal activities that the UK government's doing in various countries around the world. But yeah, I mean, going back to the BBC, essentially, yeah, I mean, everyone who pays the TV license is potentially committing a crime of funding terrorism.
Now, without being a legal expert on the British legal system, based on what you told me of that Supreme Court ruling, could your case be appealed? I mean, could it be appealed and somehow, if the right circumstances happen, be brought all the way up to the Supreme Court to decide on that issue?
Because I changed my plea to guilty, I have somewhat restricted, process or options that I can take. I've got a couple of sort of simple things, just challenging the sentence, for example, because Tony Rook got a conditional discharge and no fine, whereas I obviously got clobbered with a whole bunch of costs and etc. I can put it up for judicial review, which goes to a district judge. There is an appeals process. It obviously gets more and more expensive, and in theory, you'll come up against people who perhaps don't want to see the TV license ever classed as being not a strict liability offence. I mean, for me, I've got other legal action, and I don't really want to. I'm not going to pay the TV license, but at the same time, I don't really want to pursue this too much. But I would encourage anyone who, if they've looked at the evidence of what the BBC aren't presenting, if they come to the same conclusion that I have done, then they will have reasonable cause to suspect that their funding of the BBC, of the TV license, is furthering the purposes of terrorism. But that's obviously up to them to make that decision themselves.
Now, the media in your country, did they cover your case at all? Have they covered you at all in your outspoken activism for 9/11 Truth?
No, not at all. There's been bits and pieces from sort of local press up in London, where I've been involved in doing a sort of Building 7 9/11 Truth play. But No, I mean, there's been no coverage at all. I mean, every year every year for the last 13 years, they write to us. A features editor will write to us, perhaps wanting to do some sort of an angle. I did 2 documentaries last year. The first documentary was a pretty awful hour-long documentary called "Terror in the Skies" or something, and the guy got to. The only reason I agreed to do it was I saw the sort of list of questions beforehand, and he got to the favourite one that pressed my buttons. He goes, how do you, 13 years on, how do you feel? And of course, I just launched into the official narrative being a pack of lies, and there's no evidence to back up hardly any of the official narrative. And the guy just turned around and said, "Well, okay, great, but that's not going to make it into the final documentary." And I did another documentary, which was sort of behind the scenes identification process through DNA of the World Trade victims, which I did more from a sort of personal point of view rather than trying to uncover anything. But rather than them actually covering my, what I believe about 9/11, which is not the official narrative. But both the director and the producer are aware of my views, and I'd say every sort of fifth line that I was saying something on the lines of 9/11 is an inside job or something like that. And of course, none of that was ever going to make the final documentary. But there's not been any coverage at all. Now, Tony Rook managed to get, for his BBC court case, a sort of online article in the Daily Mail, which is one of the sort of tabloid papers here. I am actually in the photograph that's there. I'm wearing a yellow hat, sort of in the background, because that was the sort of first physical reach out at any of the sort of 9/11 truth stuff I'd ever got involved in. Apart from a few articles, and I've done a few things with Press TV, the Iranian TV, there's not been any interest at all. And it's not for want of trying. They're not interested, or, they're just being told not to cover that sort of stuff.
Well, I the story you tell me about the documentary filmmaker saying, well, none of that's going to make it in there. You wonder how some of these people sleep at night, how they can be proud of this work they turn out. Yeah,
I mean, the crazy thing was he, off camera then said he doesn't believe an awful lot of the stuff that's being pumped out. But of course, he was an independent filmmaker doing obviously something for Channel 5. He's got his remit, he's got his brief of what to do, and he's got no editorial control. I think he said something along, even if I do keep it in, they'll take it out. And I did an article for a magazine, The Sun. It's a sort of large national tabloid paper in this country, and I was speaking to the young researcher who's doing the piece, and she didn't believe the official story, but she's obviously not in a position to write anything that's actually going to make it into the final copy. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's a scattering of articles written in the UK press over the years. I think the Guardian has written 1 or 2 articles where someone's questioning 9/11. The Daily Mail serialized one of the 9/11 researchers, Ian Henshaw's book. That was probably the biggest exposure, I think, that any of the national papers have covered on the topic of 9/11 in terms of the counter narratives. But there is no interest. And like I said, every year I'd get contacted, and I remember being in Thailand to sort of 2005, 2006, and the emails would start to come through in sort of June, July timeframe. And I remember just pinging back email saying, "Why aren't any of you looking at this?" And of course, it then went very quiet and never heard from them again.
Well, they're happy to use you for propaganda, to come out and say, if you were out there believing the official story and saying we want to get at the evildoers and we want to start these wars in this or that country, they'd be featuring you front and center. A nice color photograph and talking about that. I've heard this from other 9/11 victim family members that support us. They're happy to call you and get that propaganda statement.
Sure. I mean, I think the most recent one I can remember was the alleged murder of bin Laden. There's sound bites from various UK family members that they're desperate to put out there to keep that myth alive. I mean, I've taken a lot of different actions since I've sort of gone public, 2 years ago. And it ranges from, I mean, I'll talk about it if you like, all the different battles and correspondence with the authorities, but it's also some of the education that's being pumped out in the schools is just perpetuating the myth of the alleged 19 hijackers. And I was quite horrified when my daughter came home. I think she was 13, and they had a couple of lessons about 9/11, and the teachers are actually prepared to deal with people who question the narrative. And there's a whole bunch of material that's online in the UK to help teachers. Obviously, I think part of it's sensible, in terms of everyone does believe, I don't want to say everyone, that the official narrative of blaming Muslims. So there is some sensitivity in how it's taught in schools, particularly in schools where you've got a cross section of different people, obviously including Muslims. But I mean, essentially, it's just to reinforce the narrative. But I said it actually has techniques and how to deal with the alternative theories that are out there. And of course, the kids are being brainwashed. I mean, my daughter who had the lesson, she was only 6 months at the time. And so, I mean, she obviously has no recollection of what went on. But that's now going to be, firmly implanted in her brain as this is what happened. Obviously, she knows different, but for the majority of children, that's how they're being educated. Establishing this myth.
Well, and it's awfully tough for a 12-year-old to stand up to their teacher in the entire school. See, it's an unfair situation to begin with, too, because you're obviously a kid. You're not going to know as much. I mean, you probably. Well, I shouldn't say that. You can learn the facts.
Well, no. Well, my daughter had no problem
really?
standing up. It was something along the lines of, I think they go through some questions. Does anyone know anyone who died on 9/11? Of course, my daughter stuck around up and said, "Yeah, my uncle." And then obviously, I think the teacher was probably taken back a bit aback. And then she said, and then they got onto the topic of, and some people believe in, conspiracy theory type stuff. And of course, my daughter put her hand up and said, my dad doesn't believe the official story. And it's probably an interesting experience for him as a teacher to have to go through that. But no, I mean, kids, I mean, they're not, I don't know what it's like to be in a classroom these days, but I think they're given the opportunity to challenge stuff. But I know what you mean. It is harder, if you're only 12, 13 years old, to be challenging an adult, particularly a teacher on a topic that is sensitive for lots of reasons, both if there is someone who has been affected, or the fact that, the ramifications, the repercussions of who was blamed is still going on and being felt today. And obviously more so by some in certain countries where they're being bombed.
Well, I stand corrected. Good for your daughter, and we need more kids out there standing up and not being afraid. You talked earlier about how it's the authorities' job to be doing this. Just a quick anecdote. I might have said this on the show before, but I remember going to a congressman's office a couple of years ago and simply wanting to ask him to ask NIST to test the dust samples for explosives. And the night before, I'm getting all ready. I got a group. I got some engineers in the group. I got different constituents coordinating all of this, running around. I stopped to get a haircut, so I look nice, and I'm going to have a suit and everything. And I'm sitting in the barber chair watching myself get my hair cut, and it just struck me. It's like I'm acting like I'm going on a job interview to go ask a guy to do his own job. I mean, something that this congressman should be doing. I'm sitting here getting gussied up because I'm going to be asking him to do what he should be doing anyway. It's just a bizarre situation that we find ourselves in, but the real leadership of our country is people like yourself. Sometimes it's a responsibility that falls upon us because of circumstance, and I don't know. It's just kind of the curse of our times here, and it's a joy though in a certain sense that it's liberating, and you also get past these peer pressures and societal manipulation. Like your daughter you're talking about has no problem standing up. Some kids might have some difficulty with that, but the less afraid you are and the more willing you are to speak out, the better you are as an individual too. For the British people, I mean, your government pretty much is right standing alongside of the actions of our government most times, or especially in the post 9/11 world and all the actions that were taken in response to 9/11. Why should the British people care about this issue, I mean, especially since it happened 13 years ago, why do the people, in your opinion, in England need to take note of what really happened that day?
Well, I mean, I think the easy answer to that is it could easily happen again to someone they know, or indeed to themselves. We've obviously had our own kind of 9/11 with 7/7, and there are bucket loads of questions, anomalies around that as well, just as with 9/11. Like going back to Operation Northwoods and Operation Gladio, this is not new. I think it's an old technique that's been. I mean, false flag comes from, is it swapping flags on a pirate boat or something? I can't remember what the origins of the word false flag comes from, but this is still going on, and whether it's directly things like we're having a paying through our taxes for wars that we shouldn't be fighting, and obviously not only are our own servicemen and women being killed, we're also killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent men, women, and children who if and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was a false flag attack, then it's for completely false reasons that we're having these wars, which goes back to that very first thing that sort of light bulb moment in my mind, which was John Pilger's article about this war is a farce. So it should matter to people. I mean, I'd never had any interest in. I still don't really have much interest in world events, as in terms, certainly not on the domestic scene anyway, politics. And obviously through 9/11, I've had to take an interest, but many people aren't. I actually, in defence of people who are apathetic about stuff, I have no problem with people being apathetic. We're all got our own stuff going on and our own shit, and we don't always take notice of what's going on. But I do have a problem with those that just stand behind the official narrative when they've either spent very little time looking into it, or they're actually dishonest enough to actually be actively supporting the official narrative. Effectively, it's another form of disinformation, and that does drive me crazy that people do that. But obviously, it's all part of the operation, I guess.
A lot of times, I don't know if they do this so much anymore, but here in the United States, when you would question 9/11, bring up certain facts, talk about physics and common sense and the impossibility of the government's story as to what happened to the Twin Towers in Building 7, you would hear these lines about how it's disrespectful to the family members. But from what you're telling me, you're a family member that wants a new investigation, and it's disrespectful to you to leave out your views. If you're asked a question about it and you talk about how the official story is complete nonsense, that they would edit it out. I mean, it's absolutely disrespectful the way that you're marginalized. I mean, what do you think about that line when you hear that from people who just want to try to shut off conversation by saying it's being disrespectful to the families to question 9/11? I
mean, it is tricky territory. I mean, to give you an example, there's a sort of annual meeting of the British victims, and it's been going ever since obviously 9/11 the group was formed. And I spoke at the meeting last year, and for a lot of people, they don't want to reopen old wounds, and so I can understand why they don't actually want people doing what I'm doing. So that's from a family member's point of view. I get that. I do get that. But for people who aren't involved and just say it's disrespectful, I mean, they have no idea. It's completely disrespectful to have. I mean, I've not had, because we're told that it was the 19 alleged hijackers, and they all apparently perished on the planes, and there's not been any criminal investigation whatsoever. I mean, there's been the hard fought for 9/11 Commission investigation by which obviously kicked off by the Jersey girls. But there's not been any formal criminal investigation. And so, it's disrespectful to say that we don't deserve that for our loved ones that were killed that day. I mean, we're talking mass murder of, nearly 3,000 people. And I said, if people who are saying that have no connection with 9/11, they are being disrespectful. If it's a family member not liking what I'm doing, I respect their opinion for that, because they've been through it. But for people who aren't involved, for them to say, they're being disrespectful.
And now in our last couple of minutes here, this is a question I often ask. I'm going to ask you because you've been involved and into the truth of 9/11 for several years. What gives you hope? What keeps you in the fight and keeps you speaking out about this?
It might sound really odd. I think that the biggest hope I have is the recent breaking of news and accusations of the elite paedophile rings in government. Independent research have been doing this for a long time, looking into it, 20 odd years, and not getting anywhere. And I know I'm not alone in thinking this. I've spoken to ex-policeman, actually, ex-Californian policeman, who's convinced that the use of blackmail is actually what's holding a lot of the establishment together, and this ring of secrecy and not allowing the truth to come out in certain important events like obviously 9/11. If you asked anyone 2 or 3 years ago, would you expect the papers to be full of what? Certainly, I don't know if you're aware, but in the UK, it's about historical. I think it's still going on. It's about historical paedophile rings that were being run by senior members of government and parliament 20, 30 years ago. And for that to be out in the mainstream press is, given it's taken so long to get there, gives me hope that if they can break that kind of story, then, the truth may eventually come out about 9/11. The other thing is there was recently, there was a new investigation or inquest into the Hillsborough disaster, which family members had been. It was a football match where 100 fans or 96 fans were crushed to death, and there was a almost immediate cover-up by the police, and it's taken 26 years for the families to finally get the police to start and the authorities to start telling the truth about the events that day, because the media tarred it as being drunk fans that caused the deaths, where it wasn't. It was actually police decisions that caused their deaths. 26 years on, they are getting some form of justice, and I have to believe that somewhere down the line, and we haven't talked about my other legal actions, but one of them is reopening my brother's inquest and the various routes and the path that's going to take me, and also potentially introducing a legal complaint into the US system. I'm in contact with a US family member who has a lawyer who is also looking to do the same. And yeah, it's going to be hard for all the reasons I said about the way that the elites protect themselves, particularly in the legal system. But got to give it a go. I've got to fight.
Well, we'll have to have you back on to talk about those things, but I've said it so many times. I think the boundary lines between countries are being redrawn on the internet, because I feel more kinship with someone like you than I do with Barack Obama or even my own congressman. So, Matt Campbell, thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Oh, thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
This program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.